Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to see you here, and welcome once again to another edition of Sea Stories. Tonight we're joined by Seamus Duffy, who a good friend of mine. We're going to talk a little bit about the compass and what's going on and how things are working with that and how to adjust it as we go. Before we get too far into this, hey Seamus, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much for having me
That's
here
the right
tonight.
thing to say. We've had some technical difficulties in the start of this, and I apologize for our late start, but thank you for joining us anyway. As we get going, let's take a moment. We now have a chat screen up, and in that chat screen, and if you guys would just type in where you're joining us from. Ooh, Belle, Quebec. That's pretty cool. And I'll type in Annapolis. And oh, good. Marblehead, fantastic. Chicago. Oh, all over the place. I love you guys. This is fantastic. Well, you're well attended. Good for you. That's awesome. Um, Beautiful. Looks at all these Tom's River. I've been at Tom's River. Yeah. What? Julie's from Tasmania? So far away. Well, welcome, welcome. I guess at Tasmania, it's probably about 12 or 13 hours opposite us or something like that. Anyway, having said that, Seamus, it's good to see you again. And, we have a little bit of history, you and I. Your father, of all things, actually adjusted compasses for my sailing school back in the 80s. Oh my God. And then we had you out to adjust mine. So it's been great fun to come back across you now that you're all grown up like I am. Tell me a little bit about what you do and who you are.
Yeah, well, it all happens too fast. Well, I just want to especially say thank you very much for having us here tonight. And a great shout out to the Great American Schooner Association and Mr. Duncan Hood for putting on these sea stories. I'm very honored to have able to give my sea story because, as I like to say, I'm the son of a sailor. And this has been a great business to be in, and our paths professionally have crossed as well as socially. And I appreciate you inviting me to come here and share. I was looking through your chat there. It's quite vast. And who's there? Big shout out to Marblehead, Massachusetts. I actually lived in Marblehead when I was in high school down on Washington Street, and it's where I actually grew my fondness for sailing. Because people in Marblehead really didn't ride bikes. They just used to sail around the harbor a lot. But anyway, that brings us to why we're here tonight. And it's a pleasure. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you can see my slides okay. We're trying a little difficulty of getting them to even out. So I'm going to be a little bigger than normal. So we'll just be talking about the slides really where you see the Annapolis Compass today. And to bring us around, Annapolis Compass is a business that has been in my family. It was founded in the early 80s. I have presently been running it since about the early 2000s, 2008 to be exact. And it's a very unique business in the fact where it takes care of a very strategic need in the nautical industry. But it's an industry that has really I've long learned it from a trade as being a part of an apprenticeship, so to speak. And I've personally been running the business for the last 20 plus years. And it's really, it's introduced me to a lot of great individuals, taken me to a lot of great ports, and I've been on many, many great vessels. But when we look at the compass, and I talk about compasses and everything, everybody, I'm sure, who's on this call knows what a compass is, seen a compass, and usually has some good understanding of what a compass is and why it does what it does. But very few times do I run into people that really understand where it came from, how it got developed, what turned into the technology that we use as a mainstay today. So in our brief little time tonight, what I would like to do is we're going to take a step back, and I'm going to start with the origin, and we'll go through how that developed into the average everyday uses. And then we'll kind of finish up with what you see today and where my business fits into this industry. because when we look at the compass, everybody has an understanding. And so this is basically how we all start. We start with the points of the compass. We all know about the north, the south, the east, and the west. These are what's known as the cardinal points. As I was describing earlier, this is what everybody knows that a compass does. But what we want to do is take a step back and understand how it does what it does. And this is where it takes us. Are we progressing now there, Duncan? So now do you see the Earth with the magnetic fields around it? Okay, my apologies. So what I was talking about earlier is the Earth is on a 23-degree tilt. And out of that 23-degree tilt, the Earth is rotating as it's spinning through space. What you'll notice here is out of the South Pole will come energy fields that will surround the atmosphere and come back in the top portion. And that top portion is what we know as magnetic north. It really has a negative charge because, as we all know about magnets, positive attracts negative and negative attracts positive. So if you look on from the north magnetic pole to the south magnetic pole, it really is one big continuous magnet. And it cannot operate without the pushing of one and the pulling of the other pole to make this continuous energy force float through the Earth. And so all of these fields, how did we discover them? Well, here's a picture of a shepherd on an island of Greece 4,000 years ago. And like all good stories, it starts with a shepherd in a field where he was tending to his flock. And on the end of his staff, which had a steel hook, the hook was attached to a rock. It stuck to this rock and they could not free it. It took several men. Well, when they gathered the elders, the scientists, and the philosophers of the time on this island of Greece, and they found that this pole had this energy. And what they did is they named this energy after the shepherd, whose name was Magnus. And this is hence how the word magnetism was born. Now, to understand how magnetism comes into what we would call the modern day compass, we need to travel some 4,000 miles to the east and 2,000 years into the future. And this is where we wind up in the continent of Asia, which is in the portion of which we now know as China. And in China, they took this magnetic rock, which is called lodestone. And lodestone was what was attaching the shepherd's staff. And this lodestone has unique magnetic qualities that are natural, and they're formed all throughout the Earth. But what's unique about lodestone is that it can be broken up or shaped into all kinds of different sizes to get different results. So the ancient continent of Asia, they were at the time some 2,500 years ago, they were all out there and they were charting the sky. And the reason they were looking into the sky is because they were studying the constellations. And all the constellations would move as they thought the constellations were moving around them at the time. But they did notice that after they would continuously map out the constellation in the sky, they found that they would start to repeat themselves. But they had a difficult time knowing where to start and where to stop. So over the course of several hundred years, the ancient Chinese philosophers developed this apparatus. And what this is a vessel filled with water, and in the water there is a piece of bamboo with a rock of lodestone on top. And what they found is no matter where they turned this vessel full of water, the lodestone always pointed to the same direction. And what this allowed them to do is every night as the stars came up, they would take the lodestone and look where it was pointing, and it always pointed to the same star. And that star is what we look up to today and we call the North Star. So when they took the North Star, they used it as their central reference point to mapping the constellations of the sky. And this went on for many, many years, several hundred years. And what they realized is that as they looked at the North Star, they realized that there was one constellation that continually pointed towards the North Star, but rotated around the North Star. And that today we know as the Big Dipper. And if you can look at this diagram here, you can see how each season the Dipper was in a different place. But at the same time, the lodestone was always pointing towards the North Star in the middle. And this is how, when the ancient Asians started to understand that they could tell time through the constellations in the sky by mapping them on a continual basis. So what they did is they ended up defining this. And this is basically what the Chinese called the South Pointer. They took the Dipper and they made it out of lodestone. And then they placed it on a non-ferrous, either bronze or some type of wooden platform. And in that wooden platform, they would be able to tell where the North Star was. So the Big Dipper represents the spoon, and the spoon points towards the North Star. The tail of the spoon was pointing in the opposite direction, or south, and that's how it came with its name, the South Pointer. But if you look real closely at the base that this Dipper of lodestone is sitting on, you'll notice that it's broken into 4 quadrants. And these are the 4 quadrants that basically we know as seasons today. And these seasons all were broken out into what we know as months, and days. But back then, they measured it in 20 or 13 months with 28 days in each month. And that's how they measured the solar constellations in the sky. And ironically, when you take 13 and multiply it by 28, you come up with a number just short of 360. So there you have the relationship to the 360 degrees of the circle, which is what we have for a compass today. And over the next couple hundred years, the Asian philosophers redefined this lodestone South Pointer, as they called, and it became part of their feng shui, understanding how the human should operate in certain seasons. And this leads into the astrological signs, and this is where they started to name the different years after animals, because they all said that the when you were born and where the South Pointer was pointing had a reference onto your personality and your destiny. But on the left here, you can see this is where the South Pointer was starting just on its primitive form, but these were pretty common in the wealthy households of the time. Now, as we venture to the right here, you start to see where they have a vessel filled with liquid in a wooden bowl with a wooden spoon or dipper. But if you see the black little piece, that is the first part of taking the magnetism of the rock and having it point towards the North Star. And meanwhile, this was a portable type of a unit where they could point to any constellation in the star based on the degrees of separation that this South Pointer was pointing to. Moving on, when we had the nautical fishermen they had their own rendition of a South Pointer, and we're starting to see where they took a piece of lodestone and they carved it like a fish. And they would put it onto a piece of cork and they would float it in a vessel of oil. They would take this offshore with them when they were fishing, because they knew whichever way the fish was pointing, they would go the opposite direction to get back home and find land. And this is where we start to see where the mariners are adapting the compass for their ship use. Here we'll come into, we wrap up towards where the Asians start to, and this is a late or early 18th century type of a version of where you can see that the compass is starting to form based on the outer rings, which were the calendar or the celestials in the Asian lifestyle. But you can start to see where the pointers are becoming very, very thin, and they're also inside and incorporated to where the calendar at the time that they used. Which brings us up to here, which is about the 10th century, where they decided to make what we now call the wet compass. And as you notice, this is the wet compass, which is the basis of what we use today. And here you can see that that is a piece of lodestone floating in oil with a piece of cork keeping it afloat. And as the same thing, you can start to see where there are the Asian writings of Chinese around the outside, which are the starting to find out the different points of where to point to so they could turn around and find the opposite, but it was giving them basic directional headings. Up the upper left, you'll see this was a dry compass. This was a compass that had no fluid, but this was used for packing overland. This is what the explorers would use to go and look at when they were doing the travels. So much so that these two compasses were discovered by a famous explorer who left Europe and went to the East for 20 years by the name of Marco Polo. And Marco Polo actually introduced these two compasses, as well as this compass, which turned out to be the mainstay of the floating compass. He brought back to Europe at the 11th century and introduced them to the Europeans, who started to use them for their travels on both land and sea. So what we'll have here is the 11th century to 13th centuries, where the Europeans really took the basic Chinese technology at the time and turned it into the modern day compass of headings of what we see today. And they decided that when they were out there, they took and decided on the compass rose. Now, the compass rose, as we see here today, as we know, north, south, east, and west, was really developed by points of sail that the big square rigging ships could sail into and out of the wind. So what they would do is, you've ever heard how many points off the wind you are, that is based upon the points of the compass rose. Now it's been adapted into the segmented points, which we call quadrangles, and we use those to find the differences. So as you start to see from the 11th century up until basically the late 17th, early century, this is where the compass took on its mainstay of helping individuals understand navigation throughout the world. And this is where for Duncan to have a little brief message for you.
All right, there we go, Seamus. Let's hit your share and see what we got. There we go.
Okay.
Thank
So
you.
now, today, we're going to talk a little bit more. As we understand how the technology was developed and where it came from, we're going to talk about the modern day compass that we all see today. In all of our mariner journeys, we talk about the wet compass. And the wet compass is really nothing more than a compass with a vessel filled with an oil. And the oil is there to help dampen the compass from swinging wildly as the seas are unpredictable. A lot of your standard compass, as you'll see, this is a typical binnacle mount compass, and it's a really simple instrument, but it's been refined over the time, but it has just a really basic, simple process, and it finds magnetic north. So if you were to take a compass and put it in a field in Iowa it will always find magnetic north because there's no interference to the magnetic field between magnetic north and the actual compass. Where the situation comes for us is when you introduce that into a marine vessel where there's all kinds of extraneous types of things. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But to understand the basic compass, we have to look at the compass card. And this is a breakdown. As you can see, the east and the north headings. And what this represents is the compass card inside of the globe filled with fluid. But what's the most important thing to look at is at the bottom, you can see that there are two sets of magnets. These are these grayish type tubes right there in this diagram. And what they are basically, they're just two very strong magnets that are attached to the bottom of a compass card. Now, they're always going to point towards magnetic north. And remember, these magnets have a positive end that's going to point towards magnetic north and a negative end that's going to be drawn towards the South Pole. So it's always going to stay on that plane, no matter which way the vessel goes. Because we all have to remember that when we're out in our vessels, our compass never moves. The vessel moves around the compass. And as we work on compasses and adjust, that's why it's called swinging a ship. Because what you're doing is you're moving the vessel around the compass, and the compass is stationary. And we're several different types of compasses. Here's a picture of what's called a Kelvin White compass. And the reason I show you this is it's over 100-year-old technology, this exact same compass, and it's still manufactured this way today. It's called the Kelvin White Company. It's out of Seattle, Washington. And it really is just someone who built something very proper, and it had lasted the time. And I still see and service these compasses on a regular basis in the commercial fleets. A lot of tugboats and small to medium ships about the 200 to 300 foot range still have these compasses in their bridge, navigating them around the world. Oops. The next is your standard binnacle compass, but here you'll see where we introduce the quadrangle spheres. And quadrangle spheres play an important part in keeping the compass heading correct. We're going to get into a little bit more of that in a few slides. On the bottom here, you'll start to see, this is what you'll see the most of every day in our recreational boats. This is your standard. This is a Ritchie compass. There's also a Danforth and several else, but this compass has been around. We see it the most. It's basically the same as the other compass without the quadrangle balls. It just has a stainless steel cover on it. And what that, usually we'll see this on sailboats at the helm, or you'll see it on the console deck in front of a helm of a power boat. Very accurate. This is a pretty much standard on all of the super yachts you'll see going up and down. This type of compass is just, it's one of those technologies that has come to hit its state and time and really just functions exactly like it should. And then the last compass here I'll show you, this is the crown jewel of compasses. This is what's known as a Plath compass. It is a German-made, handmade, with a crystal ground glass. It has precision jewel movement, and it is probably the greatest compass that we've ever seen. And the reason I spend a little time talking about it, this is the compass that you'll see on all the major ships and freighters that travel the world. This is on 90% of what's out there in the commercial marine traffic. And these are the ships that are 350, 400 feet and above. And the reason this compass is so great is it is totally independent of everything, yet they use real precious jewels to hold the card up so it spins perfectly with no friction. They've been making these for 75 years now, and it's absolutely the state of the art for the commercial traffic. So if you're ever out on the ocean, or you're cruising up and down the bay and you're looking at some large freighter, if you look to the bridge, on the roof of the bridge, you might see something that looks like this. It's pretty common. It's called a Navital tower. And this is a tower that houses a compass on large steel commercial ships. And the reason they put them on the roof of the bridge, choosing an area they call Monkey Island, and it's because it's where everything that they don't want any interference from any of the electronics or any of the steel ship to be housed. So they place them up there as far away from everything, but it also has the greatest line of sight to the horizon, so it can continuously find an uninterrupted view of the magnetic north field. And you'll notice the quadrangle spheres on this too. If we were to take this apart, this is what it looks like. And if you look on the left, you can see where we have the Plath compass that is in the top, and then it's inside a tower. And on the right, we can show you what's inside the tower. But what's most important about this, if you look halfway down, you can see the kind of cross-hatching of tubes. Those cross-hatching of tubes are where an adjuster like myself will go in and strategically place magnet bars. And this is where we're starting to understand about how do we compensate for a compass that is being interfered by the vessel that it has or the electronics that are on the vessel. And what you'll see here is these magnets create a counter magnetic force to the interference. And a simple way of understanding it is the concept of a noise canceling headphone. Noise canceling headphones do nothing more than put out the exact opposite signal. So if you had a positive magnetic wave that was interfering with the compass heading, I would place a negative magnetic wave at the same time right in that tubes, so we would get a neutral effect from the ship and any of its instrumentation, so that the compass above it has any interference of magnetism based on pulling from the magnetic field of the North Pole. And these towers stand about 5 feet tall. So what's always interesting to realize, this is a 5-foot tower, and we're sailing down the bay. If you see these on a bridge of a ship, they don't look that big, but you'll start to realize how big that ship is and how much steel and how much electronics and electrical motors, that everything there is to create this interference. So our job is to make sure that we create that interference into a neutral signal so it doesn't interfere with the magnetic compass heading. And here is an ancient tower as it first came out. This is something from the early 1800s. And this is, it's just a great illustration. It has the quadrangle spheres. It shows them in the starboard and port colors. It shows this is it's usually made out of teak or mahogany, and it has a big brass cover. And if you look, there's actually a compass inside of that. So you not only can you have to look in, you have to look down, and sometimes you'd have to have a kerosene lantern in the back at night to light up. But this is the mainstay that the mariners of the 1800s sailed the ocean waters of the world and found themselves navigating the passages of the Pacific all the way to the Far East, all the way to the East Coast of the United States. They traveled everything with this simple thing. And this is actually a replica of the compass that is on the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Eagle, if you've ever seen the square rigger. And this is a very similar to what's on there. And that was a boat that was built, I believe, in the early 1900s, but it was a steel ship. So they were trying to limit the magnetic interference by using a wood compass tower. But as you can see, on the port and starboards up here, you'll see the quadrangle balls. And these play a very significant role in a large steel ship. And my illustration here is, if you look in the upper left, that is your typical compass tower with the quadrangle spheres. And over on the right, the blue rectangle represents a ship, let's say approximately 300 to 600 feet in length. In the Chesapeake Bay, we get them up to 1,000 feet in length, and it's still the same principle. But if you'll notice, the compass sits roughly in the middle or close to the fore of the ship. And if a ship is heading on a northerly heading, with the magnets trying to pull in the North Pole, with all that steel from the ship fore and aft of the compass, there's never an issue. It's very easy for that compass to lock on to north. But when the captain will rotate the ship, let's say 45 degrees to east, what you're starting to see is now that the north heading is off to the east, the compass is now pointing in that direction. But the big amount of steel from the fore and aft portions of the ship are starting to change. And this is where the quadrangle spheres will come in, and they're close enough to the compass in a non-magnetic metal. It's basically a soft iron, and it will allow the magnetic field still to be generated in a neutral way around the compass without having interference because the ship's bow has gone 45 degrees. And this continues all the way around the circle. So whenever you see quadrangle walls, they're generally made for steel ships that have a great amount of fore and aft in front of the compass. So as the ship rotates, the balance of neutrality of the magnetic signal is the same all the way around the circle. And this is where we go back to Duncan for a quick introduction.
This is a pitch to ask you to join us at the American Schooner Association. Founded in 1972, the American Schooner Association is dedicated to the history, preservation, and promotion of the schooner rig. You don't need to be a schooner owner to join the organization, just to be interested in these beautiful boats. As time marches forward, the role that schooners played in the history of our country is fading too. Your membership helps support educational programs and provides a base for preserving these vessels. So, join us. It's inexpensive, important, and we'd love to have you along. We'll see you at amschooner.net.
And there you go. Okay, Seamus, this is very, very interesting. Let's get back to your presentation. So hit your share button and away we go.
All right. Can you see me now? I did notice that there was a couple of questions, and we will run through the chat at the end of the presentation if that's okay with everybody. So if you have any questions, put them in. We'll address them towards the end, or we'll open it up. But here we are. Now we are into what we see every day, and we're going to go into a little bit of what I do in my business and what I see over the course of my tenure in the compass business, mainly as a compass adjuster. And here we're back to our standard Ritchie binnacle mount compass. This is the tried and true stave that we see the most of. But to understand how a compass works in today's modern day, we kind of have a breakdown here. And this is when you understand how the compass is put together and what it's actually doing, it's very easy to understand when you need to have some type of professional help or when you have something that you just can live with. But if we start at the top, you'll notice that there is a glass dome or an isinglass dome as it is. It's basically plastic, very hard plastic, the same plastic they use in airplane windshields, for instance. And that dome will sit on top of the compass card, which you see here. You can see where the magnets are held to the bottom of it, and it has what they call a counterbalance. Now, why this is important to understand is if you're in some type of a rough sea and your bow is bouncing around, if you look at your compass, it doesn't move as fast as your boat is moving. And this is on purpose. It's made to dampen it so you can hold a consistent heading in rough seas. And then moving on down, you can notice that towards the bottom, there's what we call the casting or the bowl. It's a brass bowl that everything will sit in. So the assembly sits in the brass bowl. And then at the bottom of the brass bowl, there's an expansion diaphragm. And when we put all this together, we make a sealed chamber and we fill it with oil. And this is a specially made oil it's a thin oil, but it's made not to be affected by the elements. The only element it is affected is it does expand and contract a little bit. So at the bottom of the bowl, you'll see that expansion diaphragm, and that is basically a rubber diaphragm that allows the oil to expand and contract with the heat and cold because it does live in the outdoor temperatures. And what's really important to know about this is when we fill these compasses with oil, we fill them 100% with oil and try to extract every bit of air out, because we don't want any air in the system because that can contaminate the oil and eventually lead to cloudiness or other deterioration. But this is where we'll get our first major look at a compass that has some type of distress. And I'll get a phone call several times a week is, I've got a compass that has a bubble in it. Am I in trouble, or is there something I should do? And I will address that in two ways. A compass bubble does not mean it's the end of your compass, but it does mean that it is something that should be looked at and something that we should address to realize if you are in a critical stage or not. Sometimes the rubber diaphragm over time just stretches and we can come to the boat and fix it right there on the vessel for you. But sometimes the rubber diaphragm needs to be replaced, which means the compass needs to be removed from the boat. It needs to be pulled apart, diaphragm replaced. So at that time, we would probably recommend a whole overhaul, but then you're probably good for another 50 or 70 years. The real thing about compasses is when you have them in the elements, you want to make sure that they're covered and away from UV. UV is probably the only thing that can really, that doesn't destroy the compasses, but it will destroy the compass globe, and it tends to make the oil heat a lot up faster, which ages the rubber components of it. So if you look at a compass, you see a bubble, you can give us a call, give me a call, I'll have a conversation with you, and I can give you some easy tips sometimes, and sometimes we have to come and do it. But it's something that should be talked about. The longer you ignore it, you will have a failed compass. When a compass totally fails, we can generally rebuild them, but sometimes it has to be a cost, it can't be cost prohibitive. But at this whole thing, as you put the whole assembly together, at the bottom, you'll see the compensating system. And if you notice in there, there are two rods. And these rods have little magnets on them. And this is exactly the same principle I talked about when we had the Navital Tower with the cribbage type tube system. But this is a simpler compass and it's closer to the magnet. This is how we can compensate them. And a closer view of that would be here. And if you notice, this is the base, which is in most compasses. Whether you know it or not, you generally have one of these. And this is for recreational type boats. When we get into commercial, like the Calvin White, we have to use external magnets, and that's more on a commercial side. But generally speaking, we can pretty much get a compass compensated to a 0 deviation with just these little magnets. If not, we can go external magnets and get it. But 90% of the time, this is how we do it. And if you look at these are two rods. They're either brass or bronze. And at the end of each of those, they have little tiny high frequency magnets. And these little magnets do nothing more than what we talked about earlier, is they're putting in a counter-magnetic wave to offset any interference. So the compass magnets above do not have interference and can read the horizon of the magnetic north properly. Here's another version, and this is off a little bit more of this is a Plath compass. And this is the smaller Plath compass, but you can see how they use a more intrinsic, nicer jeweler type quality, but it's the same basic principles. This is an east and a west and a north and a south adjustments to help compensate the magnet. Because remember, as the boat moves around, the whole magnetic force of the boat is moving around. So we have to make sure that not only can we get north, but we have to have the east, south, and west all compensating in at the same time. And the reason we talk about this is If you're not spinning your boat and looking at every single heading, what happens is you'll start to develop what I like to call the game of whack-a-mole. You can get one heading right on, but when you come to the next cardinal point, it's way off. Then when you get that one on, it's the next one. So you have to continually balance the circle so it spins properly, giving us the actual heading as true as possible for us. So how do I do that? Well, here is a little invention that was created by my father. And Duncan has a smile because he probably saw this before I did. But my father was an aircraft engineer and open ocean navigator. And what he did was he developed this box, he developed the technology. And what that is that is an aviational directional indicator. In fancy terms for it's an airplane gyro. It's a compact system. And what it does, it doesn't really know north, south, east, and west. But what it does know, it knows degrees and degrees of a circle. So if you look closely, there you can adjust the face of this aviational directional indicator to whatever we want. So what the main goal is, we'll pick a heading on the magnetic compass and we'll match the gyro to it. As we spin the vessel, the gyro will tell us when we hit 180 degrees. We then go back and look at the magnetic compass and see what the heading is. If the compass is not reading 180 degrees or due south, then we know we have some adjustments to do. We'll do that on every heading and we'll keep doing it in circles on little increments until we get the total circle of the compass to read exactly perfect. But a gyro is not that complicated of a machine. It's an instrument that was been developed for a long time. And here is a basic breakdown of what a gyroscope is. And to get into understand this really, we can probably go back to our high school. And there was always a high school teacher teaching a science class that had a great student participation exercise. And he usually would walk in with a bicycle wheel. And he'd ask a student to stand up and hold their arms outright, and they would hold the bicycle wheel on each axle with the wheel vertical, and they would spin that wheel as fast as they could. Once the wheel is spinning fast enough, the teacher would ask the student to rotate the wheel like on their hips. And what the students would feel is they couldn't really do it. There was too much resistance because the wheel was spinning in a centrifugal force staying in place. Well, that's the simple, basic, elementary understanding of what a gyroscope is. And if you look at this diagram, the yellow wheel would represent the bicycle wheel. But these tend to spin somewhere between 5 and 10,000 RPMs. They're very, very fast, but they'll spin so fast, they will not move off of the plane once you start the spinning. So what happens is it starts to represent exactly what the magnetic compass is. Meaning the magnetic compass will find magnetic north and it will not move. The vessel will move around it. So what happens is when we take a gyro and lock it onto a certain point, no matter how much we spin around, the gyro wheel will never move. It just gives us a relationship on that compass card of how many degrees we've moved from where we started. And when we incorporate that onto the magnetic side of the compass, they are two separate technologies that do not interfere with each other. And the gyro aviational heading indicator is such a unique, independent heading that there's no instruments or there's nothing on the vessel that can interfere with how we get this. So it gives us a real clear baseline for picking out how many degrees the ship is turning and what the compass is representing. And once we'll figure that out, we can add or subtract a magnetic influence on the bottom of the compass by those adjusters to make sure that the compass is reading exactly what magnetic north is and representing all the other headings as the vessel turns around. So that brings us up to when, as a mariner, we usually see that there are three basic types of navigation. And we'll start, there's the GPS. And the GPS is the latest technology. It's satellite based. It usually looks like a little mushroom antenna, either on the fantail or sometimes on a spreader, depending on what type of vessel you have. But what this is doing is this is measuring satellite and the length of time it takes to transmit a signal on multiple satellites, usually 3. And as that length and time changes, it runs a little computer program that'll calculate your lat and lon. Great. It's a great technology, but what one has to know is that it is a vertical measurement. Then there is the magnetic compass. And the magnetic compass we spent quite some time talking about today. This is reading a horizontal magnetic field. So this magnetic field is horizontal and this one is vertical. And last but not least, there's the flux gate compass. And the flux gate compass is usually down closer to the water line in the center of the boat. And what the flux gate compass is really, it's an electronic compass based on the magnetic technology. But instead of finding magnetic north, it creates its own little indicators to help you know where you're heading and how far off you're heading you've gone, and then it can be added into the direction. And the reason I bring the 3 of these up is the magnetic compass has been around the longest. It is the tried and true. But sometimes on a vessel, when we have a chart plotter in front of us and we'll have the flux gate giving us a heading and a GPS giving us a cog, and we can look back and forth and we can look where it's going. We all know that sometimes all 3 of these will not agree. Sometimes they will. And this can be common, or this can be a sign of a symptom. And with every service that we do, when we're out swinging a compass, we will take a few minutes, 10, 15 minutes, and walk every individual through on why there's a potential not to see the same and why you're not seeing the same. And it's pretty simple. You have to look around, and most mariners get it very quickly, but atmospheric conditions can change. You could be heading into a headwind that's pushing your bow off, and your GPS and your magnetic compass don't quite see the exact same. But you could also be going into a 5-knot current, and you're actually crabbing sideways, so your GPS thinks you're going one direction and your bow and your magnetic compass are pointing another. But when you turn around, you'll probably see the opposite. So some days you'll be coming into the harbor perfectly calm, no wind, no tide, everything, and all 3 will line up perfectly. So the question is, don't be alarmed, just understand what each instrument is telling you based on the technology that it gets its information from. And as my father used to say, this is like an individual with 3 watches. You never know which one's exactly right, but each one is telling exactly what it represents. So this is basically how we look at our magnetic compass today. We look at the magnetic compass in the middle as the tried and true, and we use it as the basis for how we would look at a satellite, and we look at for the basis of how we would look at flux gate. It really is the steady eddy in the middle that will never let you down. If you're out in the middle and you lose all your power and everything else dies, your magnetic compass is going to continue to function, because that's what the magnetic Earth is always going to do. And that's basically what I have tonight. This is our compass. It's our company. It's Annapolis Compass. You can find us online at annapoliscompass.com, or you can reach me by Gmail or telephone. But if you see anything, you had a questions, don't hesitate to call. I'm always happy to chat with a fellow mariner. And sometimes we can just diagnose and fix a problem on the phone, and sometimes it might call the service call. But either way, we can help you make sure that what you have in your navigational instruments, that you understand what it's telling you, so you're comfortable in all types of weather conditions, that you're heading in the correct direction. And that's what I have, but I'm here to stick around and ask for any questions or anything that anybody has.
That's great, Seamus. Thank you very much. Let's take a look at your comments there, and we'll see if we can work from the top down. And we got something at don't the bridge top compasses also read the bottom of the card? and via a telescope that can be seen and read in the bridge.
That's correct. That's correct. So if we go back to our Weems, and I'm sorry, our Plath compass, the Plath compass is very unique in the fact that it is printed on the compass degrees on both sides. And there are two ways that you can read that compass. And it's either, as I would do, from an adjuster from the top down, but there is either a telescope or sometimes they use a set of mirrors and lights. And what it will do, it will come down through the roof of the bridge and have some type of a display in front of the helmsman, so we can always see what the magnetic compass is reading. But yes, that's
Very interesting. And I've got another one. What are compass needles made of, and how does that affect magnetism?
The compass needles are generally made of iron. And what happens is they will tend, in the modern day, they will magnetize the iron on one side, and that is the north side. So it's basically a iron rod that has the north point with a charge, so it always finds magnetic north.
Interesting. Here's an interesting one about the gyro. Is the gyro started and run for a few hours before boarding to have a correct north to start with?
So that's a good question. So the answer to the question is really no. So what a gyroscope is, and that's actually a good point we should have brought up, is a gyroscope doesn't really know where it's heading. A gyroscope knows where you start it and how you calibrate it, and then it'll know from there. A common way for these big ships is they will have a gyro and they will turn it on, and it usually takes a couple minutes to warm up and get to speed. And for instance, coming into Baltimore, where there's the Baltimore Light Channel, you know that there's a range finder on there. And what a lot of these ships will do is they'll get on that range finder and they'll verify or adjust their gyro to exactly the heading of that. And that heading will stay stationary or for the rest of the trip, as long as the power is not disconnected from the gyro. Because remember, the gyro does not know headings. It just knows degrees from where you started. So if the channel, I think, is like 268, if you put it on 268, no matter where you go, it's always going to stay in relationship to where the 268 degrees of travel are.
Yeah. This probably has to do with a little bit with deviation. How do you compensate for latitude?
So that's interesting. If we were to look at the North Pole and know that true north is straight and our deviation goes off, or variation goes off, which presents a deviation, the further south we go, the less it becomes. The further north we become, it becomes more. And so basically, the magnetic table is going to be very close for that, but what will change is the difference between magnetic north and true north. And it varies based upon the latitude that you're in.
Got it. Here's a complicated one. I don't even know what it means. Does anyone use a ring laser gyro and Sagnac effect for correcting a compass instead of a spinning disc gyro? I don't know what that is.
Well, if I understand the question, yes. It gets to a point where it's a size, weight, and expense. But on the modern ships, the gyros on the modern ships are getting very, very sophisticated, where the computer systems can actually find satellites to calibrate the gyro, and it's like a constant upgrading, sampling a system. And the reason with software and technology and the new satellite links and the technology, you can do this so instantaneous. They can sample the amount of variation in nanoseconds. So it can really get a thing. As far as compass adjusting, we really, the reason we use this aviation gyro is because it's portable, because we can pick it up and bring it on board. If you've ever been on a ship with a decent sized gyro, the smallest one I usually see is a 2 foot by 2 foot square box that weighs close to 300 pounds. So you're not going to be lugging that or bringing that around. Whereas my box is about 1 foot by 1 foot and maybe weighs about 70 pounds.
Yeah, it's got a great pedigree. And something about recreational sailboats. They rarely see compass correction card. Are they without error?
That's a good point. Rarely do we need compass correction cards on sailboats. Generally, you have a fiberglass or some type of non-steel, and usually the compass is far enough back that it's away from all electronics. We do adjust them quite a bit, but now with the new chart plotters and the new electronics that we see inside these chart plotters, they don't emit a lot of interference. So we can compensate out whatever interference is usually there. And when we do it with the gyro system, we can get them so accurate that sometimes I never see people again. It usually takes once, and I don't see them maybe 5 or 10 years because they're refitting the boat, or they changed or done a lot of welding or something that would interfere. But the compass itself, it does, the ships don't, I mean, the boats don't vibrate that much. Like big ships vibrate a lot and they will rock a compass a lot. That's why we have to service them every 2 years. But in the recreational businesses, a lot of times we can set them and forget them, and we will get them so close that they usually always stay there.
Yeah, yeah. Someone has a compass in a plastic globe, an Iris 50. How do they make this? I think, I'm not sure if the question is how do they make the compass or how do they make the globe?
Well, generally speaking, globes are, there's obviously a seam somewhere. And when you look at a compass top down, the plastic globe has a bezel with a lot of stainless steel screws in it that kind of hold it together. So there is a rubber seal in there, and that's one of the things that will go in time if a compass is not protected. But generally speaking, they are positioned together in two pieces.
Okay. Here someone says, we moved our boat from Galveston Bay, Texas to Annapolis. Do we need to have the declination adjusted?
Generally, not necessarily.
Okay, good.
You know, it's depending on if it was brought up on a highway on the back of a truck, most likely the vibration of the road will do it. But if you sailed it around, it should be in pretty good shape.
Excellent. Here's one for the gyro that you use to correct magnetic compasses, meaning your dad's aviation. How do you verify north? Are you office? Oh, at your office. Sorry, at your office.
So you can't do this at my office. This has to be done on board the vessel, and it has to be taken out in the water. Now, as far as verifying north, the gyro doesn't verify any heading. What it does verify is where we start and where we end. So if you think of the magnetic compass and you take a heading of due north or 0, 0, 0, and we match the gyro to 0, if we spin the vessel around so the compass is showing 180 degrees or due south, that gyroscope should show a 180-degree turn. If it showed 170 or if it showed 140, we know that something's not right with the compass. So what we'll do is we will take the gyro to verify 180 degrees and calibrate the compass to the gyro. And that way, the next time we do it, when we spin the vessel 180 degrees, they're both showing the same amount of degrees in the turn.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we did on my boat. How critical is it to use a northern or southern hemisphere handheld puck type compass, respectively? I noticed some manufacturers have yellow for Australia, but blue for the Northern Hemisphere?
Well, once you get south of the equator, everything changes. And basically because the lines of decolation start to reverse. I'm not an expert of south of the border, south of the equator. I've done some studying on it, but I don't have a lot of practical experience. But I do believe that the color differences are to understand that you're looking at the different calibrations based on the hemisphere that you're in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very good. Is true north moving?
Yes, true north is moving, but magnetic north is moving more. So between the two, what's not to get too technical, but if you think of that the Earth is rotating on a tilt of north of about 23 degrees, when you look at the actual Earth rotation, and this is what the ancient Asians found out, that the top of the North Pole wobbles an additional 14 degrees as it rotates, where the south axis is stationary. So you get a top that rotates like this as it goes around. Now, that significantly changes things over time. But to do one full rotation from beginning to end with the wobble is estimated to be about 26,000 years. So the Earth is moving, but it moves at such a small amount. But in a course of our lifetime, you'll notice that airport runways are sometimes redesignated, or and every time they do that, there's always the people out there tell you the world's ending. Well, it's not ending. You have to go back and remember that we are a rotating planet in a outer space, and we're not rotating perfectly. Pretty close to perfect, but it does wobble, but it takes a very long time to understand how much it moves.
Very interesting. I have one here that says some compasses are labeled high speed. What is that?
So as we talked about compasses that dampen, generally speaking, the average compass is made for something that travels 20 knots, 30 knots and less. And the reason is they don't want the compass wobbling back and forth, and it has to be dampened. So if you think you're running through a high seas and your bow is bouncing, port and starboard, up and down, you want the compass to be able to be held relatively steady. When you get into the high-speed boat world, they do make compasses that are less dampened. So meaning if you're traveling in a high-speed boat at 50, 60 knots in these high speed, they have a different gimbal system with a different oil that allows them to move faster because it has to keep up with the speed that the boat turning.
Very interesting. Where is magnetic north? Should we take a vacation?
Well, basically, magnetic north is just to the other side of where Santa is, and it's somewhere up in Antarctica, and it's close to the Arctic Circle. It's what it really is there is a tremendous molten mass that is up there, and it kind of has offset the Earth, and that's why magnetic pole tends to pull up there.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, here's an end of the world question. How would a geomagnetic reversal affect the compasses?
Yeah, this is usually a conversation that we'll have at a cocktail hour after a long race. If magnetic Earth stopped having magnetism, it would fall over. It would just but it hasn't in, best we know, millions and millions of years. So there has been documented time where the Earth has shifted. If you look at, where the deserts are now and there used to be lush green lands, The Chesapeake Beach has fossils in the cliffs that are, 40 feet off the water. So the world is constantly moving, but it isn't, in my opinion, moving at a speed that we can comprehend. It is so much slower where it evolves, because remember, there were continents that have broken away, with Australia and New Zealand, for instance. But this is over the course of millions of years. So the theory is not really practical for our lifetime, in my opinion.
All right. We're getting down to the end of it. I'm over on the Q&A right now, which might help you around. Comment on the effect of lightning or other strong magnetic events on the ship's compass.
Sometimes they can have an effect, but generally they don't.
Mm-hmm.
Magnetic compasses are generally isolated, whereas all your electronics have some type of wiring. The magnetic compass is independent.
Mm-hmm.
I have seen damage. Like, for instance, I see a lot of tugboats that have steel bridges and doghouses, like some of the ones that have the secondary helm. And if they get struck by lightning, they can definitely have a magnetic effect on the compass. But generally speaking, in the pleasure boat, we don't really see it at all.
Got it. Dan Blake asks, he says he rarely sees a compass correction card on recreational sailboats. Are they without error, which is very similar to a question you answered a little earlier. And ready to go with that. And Stephen Ward asks, should you remove your compass off boats when putting them away for the winter? This would be asked for sail or power.
It's not necessary. I would recommend that you protect it, cover it, always have some type of covering, whether a metal or a sock or something like that. If the boat's going in to have a refit where there's going to be a lot of work, especially welding, and they're redoing, it's wise to take it off. It's I've seen it where people haven't and they haven't had a problem, and I've seen them where they haven't and they have had problems. So it all depends upon the nature of what's going on in the vessel. But just for a winter storage, it is not necessary.
Well, Seamus, this has been very, very interesting. I saw you do this at CAPCA a little over a year ago, and it's just as great now.
Well, thank
I
you.
want to thank you so much for the time you spent with us. And for everyone who's hung in there, I apologize for the technical problems we've had, but I think we've had a really good presentation. Give us a little
Duncan,
button
real
on the
quick,
way out.
I did notice that the phone number is correct. The last four digits are 9892, and that was on our mistake here. So, but if you just look us up, you can just Google Annapolis Compass, and it'll come right up, and you can find us there.
Yeah, sounds good. All right, my friends, thank you all so much for joining us from near and far. We have another interesting one coming up in a month, and look forward to that. But right now, Seamus, awesome job.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Duncan, and thank you all for attending. Let us know if we can help you out.
Thanks,
Be
pal.
safe out there.
You betcha.